The evening mist rolled through the narrow alleyways of East London as Marcus Williams finished his shift at Buckingham Palace. After 12 years serving as a royal guard, the 34-year-old had seen enough ceremonies, state visits, and tourist photos to last a lifetime. But tonight felt different. The weight of his military training from his days in the Special Air Service never truly left him, even beneath the ceremonial red tunic and bearskin hat. Marcus walked toward the underground station, his civilian clothes replacing the iconic uniform. His mind wandered to his daughter Sarah, who would be waiting at home with homework questions and stories about her school day. The divorce had been rough, but shared custody meant these evening pickups were precious. He checked his phone. 7:45 p.m. Perfect timing to catch the Piccadilly line. The streets grew quieter as he moved away from the tourist areas. This part of London transformed after dark, when the business crowds disappeared and different faces emerged from the shadows. Marcus had grown up in these neighborhoods before his military service changed his life's trajectory. He knew the rhythms, the unspoken rules, the way trouble announced itself through subtle changes in atmosphere. 3 young men emerged from a side street ahead, their movements too deliberate, too coordinated to be casual. Marcus recognized the signs immediately, the way they positioned themselves to block his path, the practiced spacing that prevented easy escape routes, the subtle hand signals between them. His training kicked in automatically, muscles tensing beneath his jacket as his mind began calculating distances and angles. The leader, a thin man with elaborate tattoos covering his neck, stepped forward first. His companions flanked him on either side, creating a human barrier across the narrow sidewalk. Their clothing told stories: expensive sneakers that cost more than most people's monthly rent, gold chains that caught the streetlight, and the kind of designer tracksuits that marked territory in this part of the city. "Evening, mate," the leader called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness that preceded violence. "Nice watch you've got there. Looks expensive." His eyes had already assessed Marcus from head to toe, noting the quality leather shoes, the well-fitted coat, the subtle signs of someone who carried himself with confidence. Marcus stopped walking, his hands remaining visible and relaxed at his sides. Years of military training had taught him to read situations like this one. These weren't desperate addicts looking for quick cash. They moved with too much coordination, too much purpose. They were professionals, and they had chosen him specifically for reasons he was beginning to understand. The second man, broader and wearing a cap pulled low over his eyes, moved slightly to Marcus's left. The third, younger but carrying himself with practiced aggression, closed off the right side. They had done this before many times. Their positioning spoke of experience, of successful encounters that had taught them how to corner their targets effectively. "Just heading home to see my daughter," Marcus replied calmly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. "Don't want any trouble tonight." He kept his tone respectful but firm, hoping to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled beyond control. The leader laughed, a sound without warmth or humor. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble? We're just having a friendly conversation here." He took another step closer, now within arm's reach. "See, the thing is, we know who you are. We know where you work. That fancy palace job probably pays pretty well, right?" Marcus felt his blood chill. This wasn't random. They had been watching him, learning his routines, planning this encounter. The realization that his predictable schedule had made him a target sent a surge of protective anger through his chest. These men had studied him, followed him, invaded his private life in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. "We've been waiting for the right moment," the leader continued, his voice dropping to a more menacing tone. "Nice and quiet, no cameras around here. Just us having a little chat about sharing some of that royal wealth, if you know what I mean." The younger one on the right pulled something from his pocket, the metallic glint unmistakably that of a blade. "Nothing personal, palace boy," he sneered. "Just business. Hand over the wallet, the watch, and that fancy phone, and maybe we'll let you walk home to tuck your little girl into bed tonight." Marcus's jaw tightened at the mention of his daughter. These men had done their homework thoroughly, and the threat was clear. They knew about Sarah, knew about his personal life, knew exactly which pressure points would make him compliant, but they had made one critical error in their assessment. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. The narrow alley suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Street lamps cast long shadows that seemed to dance with anticipation. In the distance, traffic hummed along the main roads. But here in this forgotten corner of London, 3 predators believed they had cornered their prey. Marcus slowly reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The 3 men relaxed slightly, confident that their reputation had once again secured an easy victory. They had no way of knowing that beneath the surface calm of their target lay years of training that had prepared him for exactly this kind of encounter. "Smart choice," the leader said, extending his hand expectantly. "See? This doesn't have to be difficult. Everyone goes home happy tonight." His companions moved in closer, ready to collect their prize and disappear back into the urban maze they knew so well. But as Marcus's hand moved toward his wallet, his mind was already 3 moves ahead, calculating the precise sequence of actions that would turn this encounter from a robbery into something these men would never forget. The moment stretched like elastic, tension building in the confined space of the alley. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, steady and controlled, a rhythm that had carried him through firefights in Afghanistan and dangerous missions across 3 continents. His fingers brushed against his wallet, but his eyes never left the leader's face, reading micro-expressions that revealed confidence bordering on arrogance. These 3 had clearly done this many times before. Their body language spoke of easy victories, of targets who handed over valuables without resistance, of a criminal career built on intimidation and superior numbers. They had studied Marcus enough to know his routine, but they had failed to study his background. The irony wasn't lost on him. They saw the ceremonial uniform and assumed weakness, never realizing that behind the tourist-friendly facade stood someone trained to neutralize threats with lethal efficiency. "Come on then," the leader said impatiently, waggling his fingers. "We haven't got all night. There's 3 of us and 1 of you, so let's keep this simple." His companions shifted their weight, preparing to move in if their target showed any sign of resistance. Marcus nodded slowly, his hand still moving toward his wallet with deliberate casualness. "You're right," he said quietly. 3 against 1 isn't fair odds." The statement hung in the air for a moment before its meaning became clear. The leader's confident expression flickered with confusion, a brief shadow of uncertainty crossing his features. The younger man with the knife grew impatient. "What's that supposed to mean, old man? You think you're some kind of action hero or something?" He waved the blade menacingly, the metal catching the orange glow of the street lamp above them. "Not an action hero," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a new edge that made all 3 men unconsciously take half a step back. "Just someone who's been in situations like this before, usually on the other side of the world, usually with higher stakes than a wallet and a watch." The leader's eyes narrowed as he began to process what he was hearing. Something in Marcus's tone and the way he held himself was triggering alarm bells that his street-smart instincts couldn't ignore. "What are you talking about? You're just some palace guard who stands around looking pretty for tourists." Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "You did your homework on my schedule, my family, my route home, but you missed the important part." His hand moved away from his wallet and hung loose at his side. "Before I stood guard at palaces, I did a different kind of guarding. The kind where people shooting at you is part of the job description." The broader man on the left shifted nervously. "He's bluffing, Tommy, trying to scare us off. There's still 3 of us." But his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments earlier. "Special Air Service," Marcus continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. 12 years of active duty before I took the palace job. Kandahar, Helmand Province, Syria. Places where 3 armed men would be considered a light day's work. The leader, Tommy, felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool evening air. He had been in enough dangerous situations to recognize when prey suddenly became predator. But his pride and reputation in front of his crew kept him from backing down. "Doesn't matter what you used to do, soldier boy. This isn't Afghanistan. This is our territory." "You're absolutely right," Marcus agreed. "This isn't Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, there were rules of engagement, protocols to follow, commanding officers to answer to." His smile grew colder. "Here, it's just me, 3 criminals who've been watching my daughter, and a very quiet alley where no one's going to hear what happens next." The young man with the knife was beginning to understand that something had gone terribly wrong with their simple robbery. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the weapon, suddenly aware that the confident, Easy target they had cornered was looking at them with the calm assessment of a professional killer. "Last chance," Tommy said, trying to reassert control of the situation. "Hand over your stuff and we'll pretend this conversation never happened." But even as he spoke, he was calculating distances to the alley exits, wondering if they could retreat with their dignity intact. Marcus shook his head slowly. "See, that's where you made your real mistake. You could have robbed someone else tonight. You could have chosen a different route, a different target, a different life entirely. But you chose to threaten a man's ability to go home to his little girl." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And you chose to do it in a place where no one will witness what I'm about to teach you, about the difference between ceremonial guards and actual soldiers." The atmosphere in the alley had completely shifted. Where moments before 3 predators had cornered helpless prey, now 3 increasingly nervous criminals found themselves facing something they had never encountered. A man for whom violence wasn't a tool of intimidation, but a precisely learned skill that he had spent years perfecting in the world's most dangerous places. Tommy's hand moved toward his own pocket, where Marcus's trained eye caught the outline of what was likely another weapon. But the movement was telegraphed, obvious to someone who had spent years watching for exactly such tells in situations where split-second recognition meant the difference between life and death. "Don't," Marcus said quietly, his tone carrying absolute authority. "You're already in deeper water than you realize. Don't make it worse." But pride, desperation, and the momentum of their criminal lifestyle had already carried the 3 men past the point of rational retreat. They had committed to this course of action, and backing down now would mean losing face in a world where reputation was everything. The knife-wielding young man made the first move, plunging forward with the awkward technique of someone who had only used blades for intimidation rather than actual combat. It was exactly the opening Marcus had been waiting for, the moment when theory would become reality, and 3 criminals would learn the difference between threatening civilians and engaging with someone trained to respond to violence with overwhelming, professional force. The young man's lunge was clumsy, telegraphed from several feet away like a neon sign announcing his intentions. Marcus had seen this exact movement countless times during combat training, had practiced countering it until the response became muscle memory. Time seemed to slow as years of battlefield experience compressed into a single moment of absolute clarity. Marcus sidestepped the knife thrust with minimal movement, his body flowing like water around the attacking blade. His right hand shot out with surgical precision, fingers forming a rigid spear that struck the young man's wrist with devastating accuracy. The knife flew from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering across the alley floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. Before the weapon had even finished sliding across the pavement, Marcus's left elbow was already moving in a tight arc that connected with the attacker's solar plexus. The young man folded like a broken umbrella, all the air rushing from his lungs in a whooshing gasp as he collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest and struggling to breathe. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. Tommy and his remaining companions stared in shock as their friend writhed on the ground, making desperate wheezing sounds as he fought to get oxygen back into his lungs. The casual efficiency of Marcus's response was like watching a master craftsman demonstrate his trade. No wasted motion, no unnecessary force, just professional competence applied with terrifying effectiveness. "Jesus," the broader man whispered, taking an involuntary step backward. "What the hell was that?" Marcus straightened his jacket calmly, as if he had simply swatted away an annoying insect rather than disabled an armed attacker. "That was someone with a knife who didn't know how to use it properly," he replied conversationally. "In Helmand province, we called that amateur hour." Tommy's face had gone pale, but his street reputation demanded that he not show weakness in front of his crew. His hand moved more deliberately toward his pocket this time, fingers closing around the handle of a much larger blade than his young associate had carried. "All right, Palace boy. Lucky shot. But I've been doing this a lot longer than that kid." "I can see that," Marcus observed, noting the way Tommy held himself, the more controlled way he approached the confrontation. "You've got better balance, better awareness of distance. You've actually been in real fights before." His tone was almost appreciative, like a teacher acknowledging a more promising student. The compliment did nothing to ease Tommy's growing fear. There was something deeply unsettling about facing an opponent who analyzed your fighting ability while you were threatening him. "Shut up and back away," Tommy snarled, producing a wicked-looking serrated knife. "This isn't some training exercise. This is real life." "You're absolutely right," Marcus agreed, his stance shifting almost imperceptibly as he prepared for the next phase of the encounter. "Real life is exactly what I'm trained for. The difference is, your real life involves threatening shopkeepers and tourists. Mine involved people who shot back." The broader man was edging toward the alley entrance, clearly calculating whether loyalty to his friend was worth facing whatever had just happened to their youngest member. The kid was still on his knees, making sick gasping sounds as he slowly regained the ability to breathe properly. Tommy noticed his companion's retreat and felt his confidence wavering further. But he had built his reputation on being the toughest man in their crew, the one who never backed down from a fight. Too many people knew about this job for him to simply walk away now. "Stay where you are, Derek," he called out without taking his eyes off Marcus. "We finished this, but Derek had seen enough. This wasn't supposed to go like this, Tommy. The guy's some kind of soldier or something. Let's just get out of here." He took another step toward the street, clearly torn between loyalty and self-preservation. Marcus watched the dynamic between the two remaining criminals with professional interest. He had seen this same dissolution of unit cohesion in combat situations. The moment when a coordinated threat became a collection of individuals making separate calculations about survival. "Your friend is making the smart choice," he told Tommy. "You should listen to him." "I don't take advice from palace guards," Tommy replied, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried at the beginning of their encounter. He was beginning to realize that he had seriously misjudged both his target and the situation, but his pride and street credibility wouldn't allow him to simply retreat. The young man on the ground finally managed to draw a proper breath, though he remained hunched over and clearly in significant pain. "Tommy," he wheezed, "something's wrong with my wrist." "I can't feel my fingers properly." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Radial nerve disruption. It'll come back in a few hours probably. Might want to have it looked at though. Nerve damage can be tricky if it's not treated properly." He spoke with the casual authority of someone who had both inflicted and treated such injuries many times before. The clinical precision of the diagnosis sent another chill through Tommy's spine. This wasn't someone who had gotten lucky with a single defensive move. This was someone who knew exactly what he had done, and exactly what the consequences would be. The realization that he was facing a true professional began to override his pride and reputation concerns. "Look," Tommy said, trying a different approach. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. How about we just call this a misunderstanding, and everyone goes their separate ways?" He kept the knife visible but lowered it slightly, hoping to signal his willingness to de-escalate. Marcus considered the offer for a moment, his head tilted slightly as if weighing options. "That's a reasonable proposal," he said finally. "The problem is you mentioned my daughter earlier. You made this personal when you told me you'd been watching my family." His voice remained calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Tommy's blood run cold. "We weren't really watching your kid," Tommy said quickly. "That was just talk, you know, trying to scare you into cooperating. We don't mess with families." But even as he spoke, he knew the damage was already done. Marcus shook his head slowly. "Wrong answer. See, in my line of work, we learned that when someone threatens your family, you don't just neutralize the immediate threat. You make sure they never have the opportunity or inclination to make that threat again." Derek made his decision and bolted for the street, his footsteps echoing off the alley walls as he abandoned his friends to their fate. Tommy called out after him, but the sound of Derek's retreat was already fading into the distance. Now it was just Tommy, his injured young associate still struggling on the ground, and a man whose true capabilities they were only beginning to understand. "Smart friend you've got there," Marcus observed, watching Derek's departure with mild interest. "He understood the tactical situation better than you do." His attention returned to Tommy, who was now gripping his knife with white knuckles, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Tommy felt the weight of isolation settling around him like a physical presence. The easy confidence that had carried him into this alley was evaporating, replaced by the growing realization that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. But he was trapped now by his own reputation, by the need to maintain his status in a world where showing weakness meant losing everything. "I've been in plenty of knife fights," Tommy said, trying to convince himself as much as Marcus. "Street fighting isn't the same as your military training. This is my environment, My rules. He moved the blade in a small circle, attempting to project menace and control. Marcus nodded respectfully. You're not wrong about that. Street fighting has its own dynamics, its own rhythm. You've probably hurt a lot of people with that knife over the years. His acknowledgement of Tommy's experience somehow made the situation even more unnerving. The thing is, I've studied street fighting too. Had to learn every style of combat I might encounter in urban environments. The young man on the ground was slowly trying to get back to his feet, cradling his injured wrist against his chest. His face was pale and his breathing was still labored, but he was beginning to recover from the devastating blow to his solar plexus. Tommy, he whispered urgently, we need to get out of here. This guy isn't normal. But Tommy was beyond listening to reason now. His entire identity was built around being the toughest person in any given situation. The man who never backed down, who never showed fear. To retreat now would mean destroying everything he had built for himself on the streets. Shut up, Craig, he snapped. I can handle one palace guard. Marcus watched this internal struggle with something approaching sympathy. He had seen similar situations in combat zones, where enemy combatants found themselves trapped by their own pride and ideology, unable to make rational decisions that might save their lives. Tommy, he said quietly, you don't have to prove anything to anyone tonight. Your friend was smart to leave. You can still make the same choice. I don't run from anyone, Tommy replied through gritted teeth, especially not from some toy soldier who thinks his fancy training makes him special. He raised the knife to a more aggressive position, his body language broadcasting his intention to attack. Marcus sighed softly, recognizing the futility of further negotiation. Some people he had learned over the years were simply determined to learn lessons the hard way. All right then, he said, his stance shifting into something more purposeful. Let's get this over with. Tommy lunged forward with better technique than his young associate had shown, the knife moving in a controlled arc aimed at Marcus's torso. But where the young man's attack had been wild and emotional, Tommy's was calculated and precise. The difference between an amateur and someone who had actually used a blade in serious confrontations before. Unfortunately for Tommy, Marcus had faced opponents with far superior training in environments where making a mistake meant death, rather than merely losing face. He swayed away from the knife thrust with minimal movement, his hands moving simultaneously in a complex pattern that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of practice. Marcus's left hand intercepted Tommy's knife arm just above the wrist, his fingers finding precisely the right pressure points to disrupt the attacker's grip strength. At the same moment, his right hand struck Tommy's elbow with calculated force, hyperextending the joint in a way that sent electric pain shooting up the criminal's arm. The knife fell from Tommy's suddenly nerveless fingers, but Marcus wasn't finished. His left hand, still controlling Tommy's now useless arm, pulled the man forward and off balance while his right knee rose to meet Tommy's descending chest. The impact drove the remaining air from Tommy's lungs and sent him stumbling backward, clutching his ribs and gasping for breath. Tommy crashed into the alley wall, his legs unable to support his weight as pain radiated through his chest and arm. He slid down the brick surface until he was sitting on the ground, staring up at Marcus with a mixture of pain, shock, and dawning terror. The entire confrontation had lasted perhaps 5 seconds, and now both of his attackers were disabled and helpless. Craig, still cradling his injured wrist, looked between his fallen leader and the man who had destroyed them both with such casual efficiency. Please, he whispered, we're sorry. We won't bother you again. We'll stay away from your family. Just don't hurt us anymore. Marcus studied the two criminals with the dispassionate assessment of a professional evaluating his work. Neither man was seriously injured. Their wounds would heal within days or weeks, but both had learned a lesson about the difference between intimidating civilians and engaging with someone trained for actual combat. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. You're going to think very carefully about your career choices. You're going to remember this night every time you consider threatening someone who's just trying to get home to their family. He paused, making sure both men were listening despite their pain. And you're going to spread the word that some targets aren't worth the risk. Tommy managed to find his voice, though it came out as a pained whisper. Who are you? Marcus straightened his jacket again, checking his watch in the casual manner of someone who had simply been delayed on his way home from work. I'm someone who used to hunt much more dangerous people than you in much more dangerous places than this. Tonight, I'm just a father who wants to get home to help his daughter with her homework." The silence in the alley was broken only by the labored breathing of the two disabled criminals and the distant hum of London traffic from the main road. Marcus checked his phone. 8:15 p.m. Sarah would be wondering where he was, probably doing her math homework at the kitchen table while glancing occasionally at the door, waiting for his familiar footsteps. Tommy was still slumped against the wall, his face gray with pain and shock. The confident gang leader who had orchestrated this robbery was gone, replaced by a man who was beginning to understand just how badly he had miscalculated. His right arm hung useless at his side, and every breath sent sharp pains through his ribs where Marcus's knee had connected with devastating precision. Craig remained on his knees, cradling his injured wrist and staring at Marcus with the wide-eyed expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. These two men had built their criminal careers on the assumption that superior numbers and weapons would always triumph over individual resistance. Tonight, they had learned how wrong that assumption could be. "I need to ask you both something," Marcus said, his tone conversational despite the circumstances. "How many other people have you done this to? How many other fathers trying to get home to their families? How many students walking back to their flats? How many elderly people just trying to live their lives in peace?" Tommy tried to speak but only managed a painful wheeze. Craig answered instead, his voice barely audible. "I don't know. Maybe 20, 30 people over the past year. We weren't really counting." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. 30 families who went to bed scared, wondering if they'd be safe walking their own neighborhoods. 30 people who had to explain to their children why they came home shaken and empty-handed. His voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the surface. "Do you understand what you've been doing to this community?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Neither criminal had ever been forced to confront the broader impact of their actions, the ripple effects that spread outward from each robbery to touch families, neighborhoods, and the basic sense of safety that people needed to live normal lives. "We never hurt anybody seriously," Craig said weakly, as if this somehow mitigated their crimes. "We just took money and phones and stuff. Nobody got really hurt." Marcus's expression hardened slightly. "You threatened my daughter tonight. You told me you'd been watching my family. Did you think that wouldn't hurt anyone?" He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "How many other children do you think have had nightmares because their parents came home scared and traumatized?" Tommy finally found his voice, though it came out strained and painful. "We didn't mean for it to go like this. We just needed money. The economy's been rough, jobs are hard to find." He trailed off, recognizing how pathetic his excuses sounded in the face of what he had just experienced. "There are food banks," Marcus replied matter-of-factly. "There are job training programs, unemployment benefits, homeless shelters, dozens of legitimate resources for people who need help." His tone wasn't accusatory, just stating facts. "But you chose to take money from families instead of seeking actual help." The brutal efficiency with which Marcus had neutralized their attacks had been shocking enough. But this calm dissection of their choices and motivations was somehow even more devastating. Both men were being forced to confront the reality that they were not desperate victims of circumstance, but individuals who had chosen to harm others rather than pursue legitimate alternatives. Craig looked around the alley, noting how the scattered knives glinted in the streetlight. "What happens now?" "Are you going to call the police?" Marcus considered the question for a moment. "That depends on you. The police would want to know about the weapons, about your friend Derek who ran away, about your previous victims. They'd want statements, court appearances, a formal process that would take months to resolve." He checked his watch again. "Or we can handle this differently." Tommy's eyes narrowed despite his pain. "What do you mean differently?" "I mean you both walk away tonight with a story to tell and a lesson learned," Marcus explained. "You spread the word that targeting innocent people comes with risks you hadn't considered. You find legitimate ways to make money instead of terrorizing your neighbors, and you never ever come near my family or my root home again." The offer hung between them like a lifeline, unexpected mercy from someone who had every right to demand far harsher consequences. Both criminals stared at Marcus, trying to process this turn of events. They had expected either a quick robbery or possibly a fight, but they hadn't anticipated encountering someone who could destroy them physically and then offer them a path to redemption. "You'd really let us go?" Craig asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "After what we tried to do?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I'm not a police officer tonight. I'm just a father who wants to get home safely. You've learned something important about choosing your targets more carefully. The question is whether you've learned anything about choosing your lifestyle more carefully. Tommy struggled to his feet, using the wall for support. His pride was wounded even more than his body. But he was beginning to understand that he had been given an opportunity that most people in his situation would never receive. Why? He asked simply. Because everyone deserves a chance to make better choices, Marcus replied. In the military, we learned that sometimes the most effective way to end a conflict is to give your enemy a face-saving way to retreat. Tonight, I'm offering you both that opportunity. The two criminals exchanged glances, a wordless communication passing between them. They had come into this alley as predators, confident in their ability to intimidate and overpower their chosen victim. They were leaving as men who had been given an unexpected gift, the chance to reconsider everything they thought they knew about strength, courage, and the real cost of the lives they had been living. We'll remember this, Tommy said quietly, still breathing heavily from his injuries. All of it. Marcus picked up the fallen knives, examining them briefly before slipping them into his jacket pocket. Make sure you do, and make sure Derek remembers it too when you see him. Sometimes the best way to honor a lesson is to make sure other people don't have to learn it the same way you did. Marcus watched as Tommy and Craig slowly made their way toward the alley entrance, both men moving carefully and supporting each other. Their confident swagger from earlier in the evening had been replaced by the careful movements of people who had learned painful lessons about the difference between appearance and reality. Neither looked back as they disappeared into the maze of London streets, carrying with them a story that would change how they viewed both themselves and the world around them. The alley fell quiet, except for the distant sounds of the city continuing its nightly rhythm. Marcus straightened his jacket one final time, checking to make sure the confiscated knives were secure in his pocket. He would dispose of them properly later, probably in one of the Thames side bins, where they would disappear forever into London's waste management system. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. Dad, where are you? I finished my math homework, but I'm stuck on the history assignment about World War II. When are you coming home? Marcus smiled genuinely for the first time that evening. The irony of his daughter needing help with military history wasn't lost on him, especially after what had just transpired. He typed back quickly. On my way now, sweetheart. I have some good stories about history that might help with your homework. As he walked toward the underground station, Marcus reflected on the encounter that had just ended. In his military career, he had faced enemies driven by ideology, territorial disputes, and political conflicts that spanned generations. Tonight, he had confronted something different but equally dangerous: young men who had chosen to prey on their own community because it seemed like an easy path to money and status. The training that had served him in Afghanistan and Syria had translated perfectly to a London alley, but the aftermath felt different. In combat zones, enemies were typically killed or captured, removed from the equation permanently. Tonight, he had chosen a different approach, one that might actually address the root cause rather than just eliminating the immediate threat. At the station, Marcus swiped his Oyster card and descended into the fluorescent-lit world of the underground. The familiar smells of oil, metal, and humanity enveloped him as he waited for the next Piccadilly line train. Around him, other Londoners were heading home from their own evening activities: theater performances, dinner with friends, late shifts at hospitals and restaurants. None of them would ever know that their safety had been marginally improved by what had happened in that forgotten alley. The train arrived with its characteristic rumble, and Marcus found a seat among the tired commuters. As London flashed past, the windows in a blur of lights and shadows, he thought about the choice he had made to show mercy rather than simply neutralize the threat completely. In military terms, it might be considered a tactical error. Allowing enemy combatants to escape could mean they would regroup and attack again later. But this wasn't a battlefield, and Tommy and Craig weren't enemy soldiers fighting for a cause. They were products of their environment. Young men who had made poor choices and found themselves trapped in a lifestyle that offered few exits. By giving them a way out that preserved their dignity while making the consequences of their actions crystal clear, Marcus had chosen rehabilitation over retribution. 20 minutes later, Marcus climbed the steps from Arnos Grove Station into the quiet residential neighborhood where he had built his post-military life. The tree-lined streets felt peaceful after the tension of the evening, and he could see the warm yellow light from Sarah's bedroom window in the distance. His daughter would be at her desk, probably surrounded by textbooks and the controlled chaos that seemed to follow 12-year-olds wherever they went. As he walked up the garden path to his front door, Marcus made a mental note to vary his route home from work over the next few weeks. While he believed Tommy and Craig had learned their lesson, professional caution suggested avoiding predictable patterns until he was certain the threat had truly been neutralized. Old habits from his military career died hard, and keeping his family safe would always be his primary mission. The front door opened before he could reach for his keys. Sarah stood in the doorway, her blonde hair falling across her face as she looked up at him with the mixture of relief and mild reproach that children reserve for parents who arrive later than expected. "There you are," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I was starting to think you'd gotten lost in the palace or something. Did they make you stand guard extra long tonight?" Marcus hung up his jacket carefully, making sure the confiscated knives didn't make any telltale sounds as the fabric settled. "Something like that," he replied, ruffling her hair affectionately. "Sometimes the job involves dealing with unexpected situations. But I'm here now, and I heard someone needs help with World War II history." Sarah's expression brightened immediately. "Yes, I have to write about how ordinary people showed courage during the war, but all the examples in our textbook are about famous generals and politicians. Mrs. Henderson said we should try to find stories about regular people who did extraordinary things." Marcus smiled as he followed his daughter into the kitchen, where her homework was spread across the table in organized piles. The request was more ironic than Sarah could possibly realize, given what had just transpired in that East London alley. "I think I can help with that," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "The thing about courage is that it doesn't always look the way people expect it to." Over the next hour, Marcus helped Sarah craft an essay about a London firefighter during the Blitz who had saved dozens of families from burning buildings, never seeking recognition or reward for his actions. As they worked together, he found himself drawing parallels between historical courage and modern choices, between the split-second decisions that defined character in wartime and the everyday moments when ordinary people chose to do the right thing despite personal risk. "Dad," Sarah said as she finished typing her conclusion, "do you think people today are as brave as they were during the war? I mean, we don't have bombs falling on London anymore, but do people still show that kind of courage?" Marcus considered the question carefully, thinking about Tommy and Craig making their painful way home through the London streets, carrying with them a lesson about the real meaning of strength and the true cost of their choices. "Every day," he said finally. "Courage looks different now, but it's still there. Sometimes it's about standing up to bullies. Sometimes it's about admitting you were wrong and choosing to change. Sometimes it's just about being willing to help someone who needs it." Sarah saved her document and closed her laptop, satisfied with their work. "Thanks for helping, Dad. I think Mrs. Henderson will like this story about the firefighter." She paused, studying his face with the perceptive intensity that children sometimes display. "You look tired tonight. Was everything okay at work?" Marcus stood up and began gathering her school supplies, stacking textbooks and organizing pens with the methodical precision that military training had ingrained in him. "Everything was fine," he said truthfully. "Sometimes the job reminds you why it's important to protect the things that matter most." Later that evening, after Sarah had gone to bed and the house had settled into its nightly quiet, Marcus stood at his bedroom window looking out at the peaceful suburban street. Somewhere across London, 3 young men were probably having very different conversations about their future plans. Derek was likely explaining to friends why he had run from what should have been an easy robbery. Tommy and Craig were perhaps sitting in an emergency room, getting their injuries properly examined while considering whether this was really the life they wanted to continue living. In a few weeks, Marcus would read a small item in the local newspaper about a significant drop in street robberies in East London. Police would credit increased patrols and community awareness programs, never knowing that the real deterrent had been a single encounter in a forgotten alley between three criminals and a man whose appearance had concealed his true capabilities. The ceremonial uniform of a royal guard was designed to project dignity, tradition, and the peaceful continuity of British institutions. But underneath that uniform, as Tommy and Craig had learned too late, sometimes stood men whose real training came from much harsher schools, men who understood that true strength wasn't about intimidation or superior numbers, but about the willingness to stand between those who would do harm and those who simply wanted to live their lives in peace. Marcus drew the curtains and prepared for bed, satisfied that his daughter was safe. His community was marginally more secure, and three young men had been given an opportunity to choose a better path forward. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not with armies and governments, but one person at a time, one choice at a time, in the quiet spaces where ordinary people decided what kind of world they wanted to live in.